My name is Dusty, and I'm one of the pastors here at Redeemer, and it's been good to see a handful of you that were here. How many of you were here that you're not on staff at Redeemer, first of all? So let me qualify that you were here last year as a participant in this event. Just raise your hand. I've seen a handful of you guys. Yeah, thank you guys for coming back, and a lot of new faces that are here too. I want to thank, first of all, Mitch and his team do a really good job. Like, this is when I think what denominations can do that would just add fuel to church planning, to mission, and all that. I think it's just, even as I describe what this event and what this next 3 days is about, it's incredibly niched and awesome. And so I just can't believe that it exists. In fact, that it's informed so much of the vision of what Redeemer has adopted over the last few years. This church has been in part formed by this partnership with Mitch and the SBTC, so really grateful for them. And then also for our SEND team, not SEND, S-I-N, but S-E-N-D team here. Really grateful for all the work that you guys have put in a lot. Just raise your hand if you're part of that squad here in this room. Raising your hand, really grateful for you. There's a couple of them that are in here. And also, if you're with Mitch and his team, everything from the video production to logistics, why don't you raise your hand so they can see who you are. There's a few of you guys that are in here, and they've put a lot into this. So we're really grateful. Even also for Mackenzie that's right here behind me, that's our worship director and is incredible. She works so hard. If anything, like what I've got to do with Mackenzie all the time is be like, hey, you've been on stage for like the last 3 months with no Sundays off. She's so tough and great, but just really hardworking and servant-hearted. I'm really grateful to get to work with people like that. So what I'm going to do is don't think of this as a sermon as much as just think about this is me telling my story a little bit about that in some ways I think sets the stage for what's going to happen over the next 2 to 3 days. You're just going to hear some other stories. You're going to love. I'm actually really excited to hear the full picture of the Resonate crew, to get just to hear that from start to finish. I feel like I've got like still shots of your story and like specific things, and so I can't wait just to hear like all of it, how it became what it is and all that. These are really great guys, great thinkers, doing really incredible things in the Pacific Northwest. And so, if there's parts of my story that like catalyze things for you, things in Redeemer from things that have been exciting and things that have been hard. If any of these things stand out to you that encourage, strengthen, make you think differently or in a new, fresh way, that's great. So that's what I'm here to do. So I'm just going to get going with, really telling about, 15 plus years of history for me and how we are where we are that kind of collides with the purpose of this event. So let me tell you where I started. So I was doing college ministry here in Lubbock. And even before that, I have to back up that I've more or less been canned as a youth guy. My dad dies, and we inherit my 14-year-old brother before that, all right? So that had all happened when we were 24, and we moved to Lubbock in large part because we were raising my little brother. And my wife's parents had moved here to Lubbock. We knew, and my kid brother was a football and track guy. We knew the head football coach here at Coronado. Just knew we needed some support. we were so young, didn't know anything, and we're raising a teenager. Good times. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily. I'm sure you guys were great teenagers. But so anyways, we came here, and my wife was applying to medical school. Could have ended up in Houston, could have ended up in Lubbock, a lot of places, I guess. But we actually came out here to Lubbock, and then I ended up, after we moved here, got the job right over here at Southcrest Baptist, an established Baptist church here, and they more or less had a Sunday school class of like 20 kids that mostly had grown up in Lubbock, kind of a 13th grade kind of college ministry. I'm not throwing shade on that. Some of you may have more of that kind of college ministry, but it's a little bit of a different college ministry than the one that was in my head. So I took that job, and I was like, I do want this to be a good home for the kids that have grown up in the youth ministry here, but gosh, I sure would like to reach some of these kids that have moved here from the Woodlands and Plano and all that. Like, I'd like to grab some of them that come out to Tech that don't know Jesus, don't even know that they need to be looking for Jesus, and that I'd like to grab a hold of them and see what would happen. And so they started me part-time. I was glad for the work. Again, I was kind of damaged goods in a way, I felt like, at least. So I got paid $1,000 a month. Was super excited about that, really. You think I'm making fun of it, but really I was like really glad to get paid to do church work again. And then that went decently well for a year. And then there was a guy that had done the missions ministry at the church, and legitimately my missions experience was, you guys familiar with like Passion, like that whole deal, Giglio and all those guys, they still do that. Well, I was going to the Passion events and at the very beginning of all that in like 97, 98, 99, I'm old. And then one day, all right, so those things that all happened, like boom, 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 like that. And legitimately, like between like some of Piper's stuff, some of Giglio's stuff, and I walked up in the open field with a guy named Jeff Lewis talking about God's glory among all nations. Is this being a central theme in the Bible? And I just was like, jaw dropped. And so I told the senior pastor, I was like, hey, Gary left, and I wouldn't mind heading up missions. I don't know anything about it, but I care about it. And he's like, hired. And so then I'm full-time, $2,000 a month, you know what I'm saying? So, yeah. And we're actually surprisingly felt like really good money at the time. So all you junior staffers, quit your crying, Redeemer people back there, all right? You're making like big, big money compared to where I was at like 27. So anyways, so I do that for a good bit. I mean, Southcrest goes through a lot. That senior pastor left for a little while, Wild West interim, another pastor comes, insanity. He more or less is... And there's a collision. I mean, a bunch of people leave that don't really like what he's doing. He ends up leaving under pressure. People that don't like how that went leave the church. Another Wild West interim. The first senior pastor comes back, all right? So, and honestly brings a ton of stability. It was a really big deal for the church. And maybe a year or two after David, who continues to be the senior pastor at Southcrest, comes back, I tell him that I said, I think I maybe want a church plant. Like I look at some of this, and I didn't really know a whole lot about church planting, but it seemed like it could be, it felt like what I'd actually had done. If you want to think about that starting 20, and then there had been a core that had grown and reached students and all that, maybe we could do that. And he said, that makes sense. And I think he said something about maybe I would kill an existing church. I can't really remember. But so we actually kind of agreed that might be a decent future. So then I just started to think about locations and really for about a year, I was going back and forth on, somewhere in the Rocky Mountain West, preferably with, fly fishing streams would seem like a great thing. Lost people and fly fishing streams seemed like a good combo. I really should have done y'all's thing, honestly. Really, that would have been smart. But I didn't know about y'all's thing. So I was going back and forth, but some days I would think Lubbock. And part of the thing that was pulling me about Lubbock was that, I'd been doing college ministry at that time for, over 8, working on 9 years at Southcrest. And so I knew the scene there. I knew Texas Tech, and I knew like how many students that needed to know about Jesus, and how many had like a thin veneer of kind of like like you're kind of raised in Christianity, and it's very nominal. It's it's just around you. It's running in the background all the time. And it reminds me, we had a guy speak the other day here at Redeemer Lubbock that's a pastor in Denver, and we're talking a lot about doubt and deconstruction, and he's preaching a sermon about Nicodemus in John 3, and he was making a case that Nicodemus, when he comes to Jesus, had a more or less a socially constructed faith that like he believed it for sure, but he's a really good guy, the kind of guy you would want to take to breakfast and say, oh man, what do I should I marry this girl, or should I take this job, like that kind of guy, really good dude. And had checked most of the marks, had lived life the right way, had towed the line in Judaism, and like was just kind of in the middle of all that. And then Jesus says, hey man, you're only missing one thing, new birth. And that feels like, and Hunter was actually making that case here, that's really what is needed for, especially in a Bible Belt context like we're in, of new birth. And I'd seen that, like some people that Christianity's running in the background, like they'd been to youth group stuff a little bit, maybe had been to VBS, maybe none of that, but those people. So I knew the students that needed to know Jesus. You may have heard Tech's a big party school, who would have known, right? For those of you Alan and I were joking that he a little bit feared for his life in the past when he came here from College Station to watch games, which that's kind of how we like it. We don't want you to get too comfortable when you come in here watching a game, or even more importantly, playing a game. And so anyway, so I already knew the needs on the campus. But here's what was happening too, is I'm coaching my oldest kid, who's now a sophomore in college. I was coaching his baseball team there when he was a kid, and I had all these young adults and families that are on this team, and really a couple of teams, one in a league and another on the little travel team that we had, and like hardly any of these people were following Jesus. Like I'm saying, like maybe 1 or 2 of those 20 plus families were following Jesus in any meaningful sense. and hardly any of them were connected to church. And so I just started seeing these gaps in Lubbock. And so I'll fast forward a little bit, that I go to China, East Asia, and I'm hanging out with what would become one of our eventual staff members here at Redeemer up until this last year. In fact, Mitch mentioned him a moment ago, a guy named Spencer, and he was a missionary working overseas at that time. And I was going to work with them. I brought a team over there, and he and I were hanging out on a trip. We'd shared a hotel room, and we're talking about this, and he's like, "Where's it going to be?" And I said, "Well, actually," I'd been going back and forth with, out in the West and Lubbock, and I said, "Man, I think it's Lubbock." And I think that there's a really unique group that we can reach on campus and with adults, both in the community and at Tech and LCU. But I also think that because of who we'd reach, I actually think we can do a lot of even what we're here to do right now with mission sending. That what would happen if we got really intentional about this, and not just a college ministry that cared about global missions, but what happens if we had a whole church top to bottom that cared about the unreached of the world and wanted them to know who Jesus is, and a whole church that's designed around reaching people but then sending. And then what happens if we were to have, in addition to planting Redeemer Lubbock, but what happens if I could replace myself over and over and over again, that maybe I don't need to go to Salt Lake, which was something I thought about a lot, or Boise, Idaho. What happens if we could develop other church planters because of our context in a college town, and that we could just churn them, And so that was where that conversation left off. But then the last thing I said is, man, they're never going to go for it. And the only other thing I'll add about that part of the story is 3 weeks later, we're at some conference in Euless, at some Baptist event. I can't remember what it was. And our pastor, David, that I told you about earlier, over breakfast, one of those little continental breakfasty kind of Texas waffle kind of deals, says that some of the speakers at this event had talked about church planting. And he says, I wish we could plant a church in Lubbock. Just drops that. And my jaw this never happens. And some of you in this room have had that have planted churches, even had contentious plants with the church that he'd been at. And I asked if I could take him to lunch the next day, and I told him everything I told you, and said, "Look, this is who I think we can reach that would be unique. I don't think that church plants over and against existing churches. I think it needs to complement one another in a community like this. And I thought we could just have a unique voice and reach some unique people. And here's what we could do with church planting, and here's what we could do with international missions." And he's like, "Yeah." Which is shocking because of all the things I told you about earlier that the church had been through. I mean, incredible. Church had never planted a church in 60 years intentionally. It kind of unintentionally planted a couple that year, honestly. So from the very beginning, the DNA was church planting. And there's a whole lot of, not only for me to plant, but even for us to be a church that when we were at a place of health to reproduce ourselves, that we could be a church planting church. And there's a lot of scriptures. Again, this isn't a sermon, but just to give you a sense of the kind of scriptures that were impacting me. I looked at the whole of the book of Acts, specifically in Acts 1:8, it says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all of Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth." I think you can make a case that that's the thesis of the book of Acts. It's how did the gospel message and the church get from Jerusalem all the way to the ends of the earth, the known ends of the earth at the time, which would be Rome. And you can even see at the end of the book, Acts 28:28, it says, "Therefore let it be known to you that the salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will listen." And so in some ways in the book, at the very end of Acts, it says, well, here's how it kind of got there. And so you started seeing that this was God's heart is for the ends of the earth to know who Jesus is, and that we're still kind of, an organization we've been a part of called Acts 29. There is not actually a 29th chapter of Acts, but they're kind of playing clever here at this point of, there's this initial thing that happens, but we're part of it now. This mission moves forward to the ends of the earth, and Lubbock and Pullman, Washington, and San Marcos, and on and on. We're all part of this, and to the ends of the earth with unreached, unengaged peoples as well. Other passages like Titus 1:5. It says, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what I remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." So we're talking about not just evangelism, as important as that is, but the establishment of churches. So he's saying, hey, look, we need to have elders, pastors. We think those words are synonymous. We need pastors leading all of these churches in these different communities. So you have these self-governing churches in each town that you're planting with leaders that are shepherding the flock and are discipling people and catalyzing mission in their communities. And apparently that kind of multiplied out, throughout that world. Even the Great Commission that Jesus left off in Matthew 28, I think you can make an argument, is a call to plant churches. And the reason I say that is Jesus says that Jesus came to them and says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. I can make a case because there's a call to baptize. I think that is intrinsically linked to church, that you're baptized certainly into Christ, but also into the body of Christ simultaneously. And I think that's an implicit call when you're out sharing the gospel and someone believes and you baptize them. I think it's implicitly a call to you're baptizing them and starting a church. And these new converts are going to need a worshiping community. And so I think that's all not clear explicit, but I think implicitly, especially when combined with these other things. And, over the course of it, Paul probably travels about 7,000 miles, plants roughly 14 churches. I mean, you could have some debate on some of that, that it just was such a clear part of what Paul was about. When you just look at the book of Acts and say, what did they do? What they did is they talked about Jesus all the time, and they planted churches. Like that's what they did. And so these things became convictional for me to a point of not only wanting to plant a church, but also, and I think if you look at almost every mission agency out there, I don't care who you're talking to, almost all of them say that, okay, who is reaching new people that are not currently engaged in church? These could be de-churched, never churched, whatever. Who's doing that better than anything? Almost every denominational study you'll see will answer that new churches are doing that. Now, again, I don't think that doesn't mean that there's not a place for existing churches, because we're one of those now, if you think about that very long. Like church plants, by God's grace, become existing churches. And there's, again, hopefully good synergy in new churches and existing ones. But I do think that there's something to be said, and that's why almost every denominational agency, and it's one reason why, Baptist groups have funded someone like Mitch's department to say, hey, let's make something happen here, because they know that church planting is where a lot of these big gains are made with lost people in our world. So this became me. So what this, kind of going back to my story now, is the vision that emerged was that we wanted to see 20 domestic church plants and then 20 missionaries by the year 2020. 2020 vision, right? So I'm sure I was the only pastor that thought about that in the whole world. But that's what we did. And honestly, like, it was super naive. Like, we had some experience with mission sending. Like I mentioned, had Spence that was in East Asia. We'd had a few others, but domestic church planting, keep in mind, I had not actually planted a church yet at this time. So I'm like, hey, we're going to plant lots of them for real. And they're like, yeah, bro, but have you even done one? No, but. And so, I mean, in my mind, when I was thinking about this, it was like, are we going to have like a dormitory of church planters over here? Like, go over to Coleman Hall right over on campus, and 11th floor, all the Redeemer church planters. Go find one, and whatever town you want, and we'll just kind of drop them into your. I mean, I actually didn't know how all that was going to happen. It was just a dream and a hope, I guess. And honestly, all of them have been so different. But there was a dream there and an aspiration to plant and to send these global workers overseas. And so if I were to fast forward now, what really, as to how that actually played out, was really different. Some of those were internal people that were at our church that were great leaders and had done a lot of great things, leading small groups, multiplying small groups, caring for people, shepherding, sharing their faith, seeing people come to Christ, all those things, being able to preach. And so we planted our first church from Lubbock in Round Rock. And then some of them we went and found. Like, for instance, if you want to see a church in Pampa, Texas, which is up in the Texas Panhandle, I personally don't know anybody that's like, hey man, like, especially you got a dude in skinny ripped jeans, with latte stain on those jeans. I don't know that guy. It's just going, man, I know where I need to be. I need to be in Pampa. And same thing for Brady, which is another church plant we had. And so sometimes you had to go find a guy that was there and then go recruit them. One thing that's cool is Ricky's back here. Wave everybody, Ricky. So Ricky's actually a granddaughter church plant of Redeemer Lubbock, because Pampa that we planted him, which is really neat, up in the Texas Panhandle, which I think is really exciting. And so for us, for a long time, there wasn't anything collegiately focused, but it was just kind of opportunistic. We'd meet a guy, we might resource them there if they're on site. Jeremy in Pampa was a youth guy, a third generation church member of First Baptist Pampa. David Ritchie was a guy at a Christian church, had a very large college ministry, looking to plant, and we started talking. We had an event here that kind of smoked him out. We started talking. So it was just a bunch of different things. Peyton and Brady was doing a young lifestyle ministry called K-Life, and hadn't really done a whole lot of church stuff, honestly. He was a part of an athlete Bible study when he was here at Tech with several common friends. I knew him. He went back there, and then he was our first resident, so we started a residency that was very loose and in its beginning days then. And so it was real opportunistic wherever we found them. And we did plant a couple in college towns, in like specifically like Abilene and Stillwater. But those were more of just because that's where the guys wanted to do them, that were planting in those communities. But over time, I think there's a bunch of different reasons for it on where things begin to pivot for us over the last 5 years or so. Is that, first of all, we did have a presence in a lot of West Texas communities. Tanner's here that's going to be planting or is planting right now in Odessa. And so now you've got like coverage in a lot of the kind of medium-sized cities. There's a few more that we would like to see that. But we began to talk about, okay, so 2020 is kind of getting to that point now. Like we've kind of, we're getting close. And a negative of that vision was too, if it was something like our church staff was doing, our whole church couldn't be involved in. So we began to think about, okay, what's next for us in regards to sending? And even what did we want for Redeemer? And so that's a separate conversation. But here's what we started having happen is we had several leaders that over the years would head up to Ames, Iowa. That's where all this started. So there's a guy named Richard Barnes, who was our college director, really gifted leader from Lubbock that really in a lot of ways grew up here at Redeemer and, just kind of moved through layers of leadership. Very gifted guy. And he was the first one. And then after that, like his protege that took his role when Richard moved, a guy named Mitchell Johnson. And those guys were pulling me aside and they're saying, dude, I need you to know what they're doing up in Ames. And I was like, no, what? And he said, no, for what they're doing is yes, they're doing college ministry. And yes, they're planting churches, which are two things that we care about. But here's what they're doing is they are in an intentional way, they are marrying these things together. And where they're planting churches is they're planting churches specifically in college towns and with like they call it the salt company there, which is funny because Troy and Mark were here last year and I make fun of them about the salt name, so don't get mad at me about that, but Troy's taken a lot of offense to it. I still think it's kind of a dated name, but they can fight with me on that if they want. So but anyway, I told them it's like a 90s youth ministry name, but I think they disagree. So anyways, so we go up there and he calls me out in public for that. When we go check it out, I finally go up there just to look at it with a couple of our leaders a few years ago. And at this point, we're starting to move in this direction and go, ooh, wouldn't it be interesting if we got more specific about our sending vision? And so that came with a training platform and a group of people, a mobilization team called Launch Global. And we're cooperating with the Village and the Stone, a couple of churches in Dallas and Austin, trying to do some things together for global mission sending. Okay, so there's a strategy here that's forming, something we can do together. But what would happen if we were to kind of marry these things similarly? Like those guys are running really strong up in the upper Midwest. I didn't even know until after all this happens about what you guys are doing in the Pacific Northwest. There's the stuff that God's raising up. I met guys yesterday from Alabama that have the beginnings of this too. Some really exciting stuff they're doing in a real similar way that it seems like with basically zero coordination nationwide. I've never heard of this, that God's raising this up. And so we're like, man, this is an incredible idea. So we began to learn, and that's what I said earlier, that Mitch and his group has played such a key role, is for a long time, we were in the roles of learner, of like, well, tell us more. So, okay, so you plant in the college town, but then what? Like, what are you hoping happens, and who are you sending them with, and how are you going to engage the campus and the community? And so like, we just took the role of learner for a long while, and still are. I mean, I feel like even over the last day that I've been learning things from some of the other people that are further along in this. And so that's really where it is that we've been headed over the last 3-4 years. And so we planted the first church that I would say was mostly that focus with Cody McMurray in Wichita Falls. That happened right during COVID, great time to plant a church. And sent him a lot of what we're wanting to do is send that person with a college director. And then over time, we want to do a lot more. So our current resident, where's Justin at? I've seen you in here. Smith. So there's Justin Smith. Justin is our current church planning resident, and he just made the commitment. It's Instagram official. He's going to Austin, Lord willing, to engage University of Texas as well as the city of Austin, and a really gifted, humble, coachable, awesome guy. Love this guy. And he's really our first full-fledged. And so now here's what we're doing is historically what our church planning residency was is we have a thing called the Redeemer Network, which is a lot of our churches we planted and churches they've planted where Ricky and Tanner have both been through the training, and Justin's going through the training now. And they do that in cohorts that are digital. The church you're a part of also has some responsibilities. But the unique thing for Justin is he's now embedded in our college ministry. So Justin is preaching, several times a semester. How many times? 2 or 3 times a semester, and he's here pretty much every Tuesday, and just very engaged. He's a very gifted dude that also was leading a college ministry in Waco before he came here. So he's an established leader that we didn't have any doubts that he was ready to plant a church. He just needed some finishing and preparation. Here's what's cool is that you're about a year and a half away. Is that roughly about when he plans, Lord willing, on going to Austin? So he had an interest meeting the other day back in Waco, and there was about 20 people, give or take, that were connections from his college ministry there, and that church is working in partnership with us, which is incredible. We've never planted a church in our entire life by ourselves, ever. I just think it's a beautiful thing, like these cool partnerships between that church is an existing Baptist church in Waco, and we're the ones doing finishing, but they put a lot into Justin as well. So we're doing this together, and there's a lot of people that are going to move from Waco to Austin in the next year and a half. He's got a brother-in-law that's moving from Arkansas to Lubbock to do residency with him that's in here right now. And they're gonna be forming team, and then some of our current staff members and college students, maybe roughly 20 of those, is that give or take? They had an interest meeting on that, so about 20 of them are saying they want to move from Lubbock to Austin in a year and a half. And see, this is where gets me really fired up to think about it, is that in addition to hopefully some training and finishing for Justin as a church planner in general, but you're also coming with a team full of people trained, prepped. We've got a college director. You've got people that are there to engage the adult population. You've got all these people that are coming there, some support raised, some that are working jobs, but to reach the campus, reach the city, and then do the whole thing again and plant in other college towns and so on and so forth. And so that's really where it is that we're going. And I'm not ready to write a book and go, here's how we did it. Here's how we got, churches planted on every single college campus. That's way too big for us. And so really what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to continue to take the position of learner. We've got a lot to learn on this, and set up Justin for success. I think he's an awesome leader. Learn from what goes on there. Hopefully continue to have other residents both internally and some that we recruit into our residency. And then also we think this is such a big job. I'm really grateful for Resonate, and I'm grateful for SALT, and I'm grateful for the Well guys in Alabama. And I know there are other groups that are here and there that are doing this too. But Lord willing, that just God raises up a whole group of people, and other people need to care about other kinds of church plants. Here's the argument I would make to kind of pull some of this together, is that if you look back to some of the Tim Keller's church planting stuff that so many of us have been impacted by, Keller's thinking, a lot of fronts. But, one of the reasons Keller argued for going to these large cities is, New York City, because that's where he planted in Manhattan, was that everything is culturally downstream from, New York City. And if you get New York City and you get LA and you get London and you kind of get these other things downstream of that. I'm not saying Keller's wrong on that. The thing I would make a case of regionally speaking, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and, Lubbock, Texas, College Station, Stillwater, Oklahoma, and Pullman, Washington, and Bozeman, Montana, and all these things. Okay, are they setting nationwide trends? No. Are they cranking out? Policymakers? I mean, maybe. But what I would say, there's a regional effect. These are your future business leaders. These are your future politicians. These are your future moms and dads and communities. These are. And so, what I would love to see is what would happen if regionally you're upstream on these church plants in college towns, impacting both the community and the campus. And as you multiply into these other college campuses, you're also going to see some of these people people say, hey, that's great. We actually want to plant a church in Borger. And we actually want to plant a church in Brady where there's not a college deal, but there's just this whole movement of people that you're reaching. And I was just even looking up on stage. Now, not all of these people up on stage we reached when they're college students, but a lot of them we did. And you think about what that means for this church here, that these people are here with us over this time, and many of them go on and move to other cities and join other churches. Many of them can be part of church plants. And so what we're trying to do right now with our college students is say, when they're freshmen, that we would respectfully ask for you to think of 1 to 3 ways for your life. One is for you to consider being a part of a church plant when you graduate, and maybe take that job in Wichita Falls or in Austin and give a couple of 3 years to that church plant. 2 is, would you consider going and giving a few years of your life for the nations so that people with no chance to hear about Jesus that could hear by you giving a few years of your life? Would you consider that? Or 3rd, be an all-in church member for the rest of your life wherever God sends you. So if you go back to Friendswood, you go back to Katy, you go back to Austin, you go back to wherever you're going to go to, you may join a regular church, and that's great. But being a all-in, all about Jesus church member that'll bless your church, be on mission in your city for the rest of your life. And that's what we're asking for all of them from the very beginning. So that's where we're at. There's no magic formula with all this, but if some of these things spark a thought, here'd be my thought, is that just to throw it out for you to consider with a lot of you who are here with a team, is my hope for this event would be 2 things. One, that some of you already have a church in a college context. Like you already are doing that. This isn't hypothetical. You're already there. Some of you may be in that context thinking of planting somewhere else or something like that. But that you could think more strategically and purposefully about what God already has right there. Like how you can reach those people, not just find market share for the Christian kids that are already coming to your campus that you're trying to grab a hold of. That's great. But even missiologically, how you can reach those students that God has sent to you on that campus, that if it can really say, man, let's pick this up. Let's pick this up. We've got a junior college in our town. We've got some stuff we could do, and we're leaving it on the table. We haven't even engaged that over there. Let's go engage it. That I would love that if there was more purpose in our college ministry that's in this room right now. And the second thing is, what would happen if God were to raise up 2, 3, 4 people here that were going to be church planters or be part of a team that were going to go plant a church in a community that didn't have anything like this, of somebody that's really trying to reach a campus, really trying to reach a city, and even replicate that elsewhere. I mean, what would happen? This is a really small deal. There aren't going to be any blogs about this event. Nobody cares in the whole universe this event's happening, nearly, except those that are in this room, a few people that will consume this content. But what happens in this small setting if God were to do something really unique that might have an outsized impact, multiplying all through this whole region in Texas and beyond? I think that actually gets me really fired up. So I'm going to pray to that end for a minute, and I can't wait to learn and hear all the things in breakouts and some of these large sessions too. And just we're continuing to take that posture too. We've got a lot to learn, but maybe some of this sparked a thought, and I'm going to pray that that'll happen. So Lord, would you work in the hearts of people here? I have no idea what your designs are. I just know your heart for lost sheep. That's what I know. Is I know you care about people that have never heard of you on the other end of the world with no Christians and churches around them. I know you care about them, and I know you care about that college kid from Plano that's walking like 10 minutes from here on the campus and doesn't even know what they're living for and doesn't know which end is up. And Lord, would you send workers to them? And there are college campuses all across this state and way beyond that, across this whole country, where there's hardly Christian presence there, and churches that are kind of doing their thing and ignoring the campuses that are around them. And we're asking that you told us that we should ask that the Lord of the harvest would send workers. So that's what I'm asking is, Lord, would you send workers? And there might be some that are in this room that are those workers that you're going to raise up to send, even in their own city, but maybe to another town, that you'd raise up people who aren't here, that you would put, I have no idea how you've raised these different networks up that are doing this, but would you raise up more of that? Maybe even pull all of it together. I don't know what your designs are, but Lord, make it go. And through your Spirit, that there'd be an awakening in this generation of young people that would meet you and that there would be just a multiplication of new churches, all for your glory. And who cares if anybody ever knows if this conference happens or that we're all part of it, but if you are known, that's enough for us. That'd be incredible. So that's our prayer, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.